So thank you again for doing this. It means a lot to me. And not just that I'm getting to meet you here again and do this, but that you've answered your call to write about this theology that is so important and necessary and redeeming and full of possibilities. We talk in Judaism about repairing the world, and I think what you've laid out in your thinking is how to repair the world. So I'm just so grateful that you followed whatever that voice or call inside of you has been. It helps people like me who are seeking God anywhere I can find him or her with a plausible path that allows me to lead a more sacred life. So thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate what you just said. I'm part of the Tikkun movement. But I just agree with so much of what you stand for, what you've learned, what you're sharing, that we're in this postmodern time. And I like to point out post-Piscean time. We're in the age of Aquarius. And that is a time of togetherness, or the opposite. I mean, Carl Jung said in the age of Aquarius, evil will no longer be under the table. It'll be on top of the table. We can all see it, but will we be able to act? And I think it really has something there, you look at what's going on. During our break, I just read the latest thing about the Supreme Court. Gorsuch, it turns out, and if you heard this, it's just today's news, he got summoned to pay for his house 9 days after he was made a Supreme Court judge, and the guy has had 23 moments before the Supreme Court since he's been judge. And the writer said this is just as big as what's been going on with Clarence Thomas. So, the times we're in some ways, it's just so obvious. What evil is, it's obvious, and what Putin is doing and all this. And what we're all not doing, since omission regarding the environment and Mother Earth and women and so many other issues. But, wow, we've just got to rattle things up. And religion itself has to be, well, to use Howard Thurman's term, stripped down to the literal substance of itself before God. And, so that is the battle I've been fighting. I've been trying to undo. Well, deconstruct, I guess, is a contemporary word. Christianity as I was taught it, but to find what I call the treasures in the burning building. Take them out, and to travel light, spiritually. That's why we want spirituality, not religion. I talk about traveling not with basilicas on our back, with backpacks, and that's what you've been doing. And you realize, like you say, there's common ground. There's no other. That, I read your stories from swamis and from hippies and from Buddhists and from Christians and Jews and all. And that's what we want. We want the essence of the thing. All the details. They're interesting and it's fine. It's just like people wear different outfits and eat different diets. That is wonderful diversity in the human race. But to make them the only way to the divine, my way is the only way, or something like that, and then go to war about it, or with the rest, and what we've been doing for years, thousands of years. It's, we got to grow up and get out of all that. So that's where I think the word creation spirituality makes sense, because we all have creation in common. Like I said in my Cosmic Iceberg, there's no such thing as a Roman Catholic rainforest and a Buddhist ocean and a Methodist moon and a Lutheran sun. And once we realize that, put our religions into context, then we're going to chill out a little, calm down, and maybe we'll start looking for one another's wisdom and see how we can link up on that, and do the Tikkun thing, save the world, heal the world.
what do you think is the work? I'm deeply moved by that statement by Thomas Merton that I have to get the impulse for war out of myself first. Instead of hating the other, I need to find that inside of myself and root that out. And that has really spoken to me. But this idea of, do we show up fighting in the world, fighting injustice, or do we show up loving the world? What do you think is the work?
Well, I think it's both and. The loving is what I call, and I think the tradition does, is the mystic. The mystic is the lover. But that's not enough. We also have to defend what we love. And that's the prophet. What Heschel, whose job Heschel says, Reverend Heschel, is to interfere. And that means to stand up to defend what we cherish. So it's both and. And you might say that the mystical is a more feminine dimension. The prophet is the more masculine. It's also the warrior, that kind of energy. But that doesn't mean that women are only mystics or prophets are only men. No. The good prophets, you talk about Jesus, you talk about King, you can talk about Gandhi, you can talk about the fellow in South Africa, I'm sorry, his name's him. I'm 82 now, and names sometimes go in and out. Mandela. And they have this mystical side to them, as well as the prophetic side. They're remembered perhaps for the prophetic side. But the truth is that their prophetic side wouldn't have been so successful if they didn't have these other elements to it. And creativity is right in the center between the falling in love of the via positive and the mystic, and the suffering of the via negative, the emptying, the dark night. But then comes the creativity, the renewed imagination. Pershinu calls it rupture. That rupture, and that's a powerful name for the via negativa, for chaos, for everything falling apart, right? The Buddhist nun writes about Pima Chodron, when things fall apart. And everything's falling apart today. It's obvious everywhere. There's no profession that's in decent shape. So when things fall apart is when imagination gets stirred, and you move then from rupture to what Shanu calls again presence. That's his. It's interesting. I like to look at the naming of the mystical experience, and it's so interesting. Thomas Aquinas uses the word ecstasy, which I also use and I used it early in my writing before I'd seen it in Aquinas. Because ecstasis means to stand out of. It's kind of moving beyond the ego or your usual view of the world. But so ecstasy is a good word. But Eckhart uses the word breakthrough, which he invented in German, Durchbruch, breakthrough, which is a powerful word. He says, in breakthrough I learn that God and I are one. And Julia Norris uses the word oneing, O-N-E-I-N-G. She invented that word in English. She invented a lot of words in English. First woman to write a book in English in the 14th century, she was. And but Shanu uses the word presence. And I think it's an interesting word because he's an activist. He took on the Vatican, he took on education, he took on work with the worker priest movement. And I mean, he launched really the liberation theology movement. But that word presence is really a very mystical word. But I think it's very real for people. It's you can ask the question, where do you feel the presence of spirit? Where do you feel the presence of God? And you do a wonderful job of getting those answers out of people in your book. You really do. And it's so interesting. And everyone has their story to tell. It's not cookie cutter here. Well, I recently wrote a book called Naming the Unnameable, 89 Wonderful and Useful Names for God, including the unnameable God. So this is on my mind a lot. And a lot of the names I came up with come from science. For example, names like energy and mind of the universe, which comes from Eric Jantsch, an important physicist who wrote a book called Self-Organizing Universe. And he says God is the mind of the universe. And he says, now mystics have been talking about this for centuries, but now that I'm writing about it as a scientist, more people will listen. And he's right. Our culture, wants to hear from scientists, and rightly so. And so anyway, flow is another. I met a young physicist. He was 41, and he was just ecstatic about the word flow. In this book on flow, written by this Czechoslovakian philosopher in Chicago, whose name I cannot pronounce. I'm sorry, but very long name. And but his thing was flow. That he thinks God is flow. So I go through words like God is goodness, and God is love, and God is these things, flow and energy, and so much more, justice. And of course, I find a lot of these in the mystics. The mystics are naming divinity too. But then the last part of the list, the last 8 or 10, are the apophatic divinity, God without a name, like Meister Eckhart says, God is without a name, it will never have a name, and is unnameable, you see. And of course, this is part of mystical traditions too, that God has no name. We cannot name God. We can try, and that's not a bad thing. And of course, your very question is so important, because we're living in a time when some of the familiar names of God are not working for people. And so that's why I wrote the book. It's a short book, but I think in a way, it's the most radical book I've ever written, because if you can assist people to shake up rote God talk, God talk that we just kind of mumble because we heard it or we read it in our prayer services, and get down to the experiential. God is beauty is one of the names I really like. Everything can change. And, the reason that many atheists are not really atheists, what they are rejecting is theism. And I rejected theism a long time ago. What I perceive is panentheism, which means God in everything and everything in God, like the fish in the water in the fish. That's the way mystics see divinity and our relationship to divinity. God is not out there. That's theism. And the whole idea from the modern era, the universe is a machine and God's out there like the oiling the machine or something, that's just not where it's at. So, there's so many ways to talk about that, but just in terms of experience, that's where ecstasy comes in, I think, or these other names, presence, or wanting, or breakthrough. Those are just 5 or 6 wonderful names from mystics I believe in. I believe they acted their lives out on the basis of these things. Of course, God is compassion, which is Jewish and from Jesus too. Jesus was Jewish. When I wrote my book on compassion years ago, Spiritual Named Compassion, I learned so much. I learned that in the Jewish tradition, compassion is the secret name of God. And I just love that. But Jesus let the secret out of the bag. He wasn't very good with keeping secrets. So Luke 6, be you compassionate as you're created in heaven is compassion. And then to learn like what Thomas Merton did with compassion when he said the last talk he gave before he was martyred. He said compassion is a keen awareness of the interdependence of all living things that are all part of one another, belong to one another. But that word interdependence is so important today. It's the basis of today's physics. So this is where spirituality and science come together again. We can agree on interdependence, and of course, Thich Nhat Hanh invented the word interbeing. Hey, we're 90% there as a species. And interdependence demands justice because justice is about homeostasis, it's about finding balance. So to say God is justice is to say that we're involved in trying to find balance in our search for divinity, both personal balance, but group balance, and ultimately species and earth balance. So I mean, there's just so many angles on divinity. And of course, William James says, one of the signs of mysticism is ineffability, that you can't name what's happened to you. It's too big for words. Eckhart says the same thing. He says we stammer and we stutter when we talk about God. So a little humility like that is so important. But here we have a culture where we stamp God's name on a coin and on dollar bills and on MX missiles, for all I know, and certainly in sentimental presidential speeches. So we've really abused the name God, which the Jewish tradition, of course, has tried to respect by saying, you can't write it, and you shouldn't even pronounce it, except a couple special days a year. But that has been totally, swamped by the business of God talk. So, it's a big question you're asking, but those are a few thoughts about it. Did I answer your question? One of the smartest things my parents ever did, when I was in high school, we had a house with 3 floors, and my older brothers would go off to college, and we had an empty room up there. I was on the 3rd floor, and they would rent it out to a foreign master's student, graduate student. So I spent my adolescence living next door to a communist from Yugoslavia, a ex-bullfighter from South America who would, without even asking, would pull his shirt up when he first met you to show you where he got gored by a bull, and he could brag about that. And with a Singh from India, who always wore his turban. And I remember when I was a senior, I was in a speech class in high school, and you had to give a talk on some kind of, they call it a performance or something like that. So, make a long story short, he taught me how to tie the turban. So I went to class, and I picked the most popular kid in class and put him in front on a chair, and I tied the turban on and talked about it and what it meant to the Singh people. And I got an A+ for it. But so I learned this is one of the smartest things my parents ever did. I learned that the whole world is not white, and it's not Christian. And it's interesting. One guy who was from Canada, he was sure there was going to be a nuclear war, so he kept skis in his backyard. I mean, no, not his backyard, in his car, in the trunk of his car. So he was going to shoot off for Canada as soon as the bomb dropped and somehow make it to the North Pole or something. I don't know. But, it just taught me to relax around cultural diversity and religious diversity. And I went to a public high school. And my friends were Jewish or Protestant or agnostic. And there were very few Catholics at school because there was a Catholic high school in town too, in that part of town. But I chose public high school because my older brothers and sisters had gone there. And we had wonderful debates about life and philosophical questions. So I would go to my Catholic priest, who was Dominican, and he'd give me books to read, like Chesterton and Thomas Aquinas. And I thought that was really exciting, that there's this intellectual tradition to my faith. And make a long story short, I attended a retreat my senior year at the Dominican House of Studies, which was in Dubuque, Iowa, where they're training Dominicans to be priests. And I was very moved. It was a large place. I was moved by 3 things. One, the aesthetic of the chanting of the office, which is the chanting of the Psalms. It was in Latin then. But just the aesthetic of that moved me very deeply. It was a spiritual, mystical experience. But secondly, that they were studying, that they had an intellectual life. And, I had conversation with them. They were bright people. They were alert. They were happy. And so community and the chanting and the study. Oh, yeah, the sense of community. I was from a big family, which included these diverse guests in our home. And so I wanted community. I didn't want some kind of solitary kind of existence at that time. So I decided my senior year that I'd give the Dominicans a try and see if I had a calling to do that. And I loved college, and there was intramural sports, and I loved sports. But a big part of my growing up was this, that when I was 12, I got polio. It was 1952, just before the next year they had the vaccine. But not my year's last year. And a friend of mine had died of polio the year before at 10 years old. I was 11. But I lost my legs, and my father was a football coach, my older brothers were all state football. And I thought, well, that's what it means to be a man. I'm going to play football someday. And then I couldn't walk. So that was interesting. That's what Shanu would call a rupture. And I was in the hospital for months, and they couldn't tell me if I'd walk again. But then I did get my legs back after about a year. And I remember saying to the universe, I'm never going to take my legs for granted again. And that to me is a mystical statement, not to take for granted. So, and of course, in a real way, I left my father at 12 or 13 because he was a football coach and I looked like I wasn't going to be going that way. And a lay brother, a Dominican brother, would visit me regularly, who was the opposite of my father. He was, my father was quite, what would be the word for that? Sort of, but anyway, assertive and all that. This guy was very contemplative. And, there was like a sweetness to him. And as it turned out, he ended up being a Trappist monk for many years, though then he left the Trappist order after like 30 years or so. But he was just, and I realized, there are different ways of being a man. Yeah, this contemplative thing, that's interesting. And this guy's happy. He's at least as happy as my father. I remember once I walked into the living room, and I just remember it very vividly, and someone was playing Beethoven's Ninth, and it just hit me for the first time in my life. No, Beethoven's Seventh. Yeah, Seventh that night. I wanted to just dance, just dance my life away. So it was an awakening. Beethoven was an awakening. Shakespeare was an awakening. And in my junior year, between junior and senior year summer, I read Tolstoy's War and Peace. And I told a friend, it blew my soul wide open. And I wanted to explore what happened to me. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it was important and special. It was a mystical experience, but I didn't have that language. And that's why I joined the Dominicans, to explore what happened to me. And so all that was my growing up. And again, I want to emphasize the nature thing. For example, I had Native American dreams when I was young, a lot of them. And the Native American spirit is very alive still on the land of Wisconsin. Certainly was back then, it still is today, I think. But that was important to me. And I also read a lot about the Holocaust. That was very meaningful to me, how people survived that, like Viktor Frankl and so forth here, and what it meant about human beings, that we could be so awful and yet so amazing. So that played a role definitely in my consciousness too. And I attended daily mass throughout high school. I didn't tell anyone in school. My friends were not Catholic, but I would hide it from anyone. But it meant a lot to me. So I had a lot of mystical experiences at Mass, especially Saturdays, and I didn't know why. Now I know why. Saturday in the Catholic Church back then was dedicated to Mary, which is, of course, the goddess. And they drew these wonderful readings from the wisdom passages in the Hebrew Bible. So, Book of Proverbs, before creation, I was with God, the creator of the world, delighting to be the sons and daughters of the human race, and so forth. In the book of Sirach, I walked the vault of the sky and the sands of the ocean and all that. And this stuff really moved me. It was not part of what I was getting at school about what it means to be a man. That this was something new that really hit me in my heart. And obviously, I can say it was the goddess, it was the feminine dimension. And the Catholic Church, to its credit, kept that alive not really knowing what it was doing, to be honest, but at least it was there.
What would you say was the first time in your life you feel like you had to or chose to rely upon God as you understood God?
Even when I had polio, but I was young, 12 years old is young. But, that I wasn't afraid. And my mother told me that years later. She said, your father admired physical courage, sports and everything, but you taught him moral courage. Because when you got polio, he really freaked out because his father got polio and was in a wheelchair the rest of his life. He lost his living, which was repairing vacuum cleaners or something, and he started to drink. And I didn't know that about my father's background, but I never knew this about what my mother said. I was stunned with what she said. This was when I was in France. She came to visit me. She said, you taught your father moral courage. So what do you mean? She said, when you got polio, he really had to work himself up to go and tell you. And when he went and told you had polio, you said, oh, I know it. I heard someone on the phone 2 weeks ago talk about it. And your father just freaked out that you didn't freak out. And I just, when you're young like that, at least that was my experience, you don't worry about death that much. And you don't think about it. I don't know. You're too busy living, I guess. And so that was interesting. And it changed my relationship to my father for the good, for the rest of our lives, really, because he was very critical of me when I was a child because I was small and skinny and they didn't like that. And I had this side to me that was more poetic, I think, than he was used to. But in high school, we never had one argument in all my years in high school. And when I told him I was going to, well, actually, I told my mother I was thinking about becoming a priest. Then she told my father. And he was very moved by that. And it meant a lot to him coming from a Catholic church and a lot of Catholic schooling because he went to a Catholic high school, Augustinians ran it in Chicago, St. Rita's. And then he went to Villanova, which is Augustinian college. And so it meant a lot to him, but I didn't do it because of him. I just felt called to explore.
Do you think this idea of relying on God is an old idea? Do you think it's inconsistent with creation spirituality? Like, is that a holdover from an externalized understanding of God rather than an internal or mystical understanding of God?
Well, I guess I'm more at home with the term co-creation, and that the Holy Spirit inspires us. Spirit inspires us. And I believe in angels. I've written a book on angels with a scientist, Rupert Sheldrake, that angels show up at times for intuition, because intuition is what they're all about. They don't have to go to school. They don't have to write books or read them. So I do think that the presence of spirits that, as Aquinas says, carry thoughts from prophet to prophet. Like my image is a bee carrying nectar from flower to flower. That to me is more reliance, is co-reliance, So yeah, I guess I'm a little uncomfortable with over with using that word reliance too much, but it may be just because I see a mutual thing going on between us and spirit. And sure, you want to call on spirit and for help and for guiding us and for keeping us steady, grounded. But spirit is always there. And God is always here. So I think we can exaggerate the need for us to rely on God if we have this undercurrent of the presence. That's where the word presence comes in again.
Like the idea of relying on God as a dualistic idea.
It can be.
Yeah.
You know, I don't want to dismiss it, but I call on God like most people do when you're in a foxhole or something. But the presence is really interesting because I'm just getting into Shanu and it has begun to grow on me and dawn on me what a powerful naming that is, presence. If the presence is there all the time, we don't have to spend a lot of time calling.
No, it's more about being reminded.
Being reminded, that's good. My Striker says Christ is a great reminder.
What about times you've doubted your faith, times you've doubted presence and its existence?
Well, probably my biggest doubts are about the church, which claims to be present, a presence, the mystical body of Christ, for example. And of course, I've seen a good deal of the shadow side of the organization. And so I've understandably, I think, sought presence beyond the confines of a self-identified organization or structure. And I think that's what deep ecumenism is. I think it's looking for divinity everywhere, as you say. And I can see it in my ancestors. I can see it in the struggle and the theological effort and often political effort to survive and to celebrate God and nature and to share it with other generations and so forth. But again, I've experienced it in sweat lodges. I've experienced it in Sundances. I've experienced it in Vision Quest. Presence of the divine. So I don't find it just at Mass or from the Catholic Church. So when the Pope's fired me, he doesn't need me. He's told me he doesn't need me. Furthermore, the Catholic Church under these popes, that was during Benedict's time, there's going to be no creativity in liturgy, but these young people, a new generation, a new era of postmodern young people with new art forms like DJ and VJ and rap, they deserve, worship experiences. And I can help. They tell me I can help. They said, we're following your theology of the cosmic Christ, but if you were with us, you could run interference because you get what we're doing, and most priests and theologians don't. So that's when I went to Bishop Serene, the Episcopal Bishop in San Francisco, and said, here, I'm thinking of becoming Episcopal priest, but only for one reason, to work with young people to reinvent forms of worship. He said, go for it. We're not doing anything for young people. And we talked for a while, and then I said, well, I have one question for you. Will you protect me from your right wing? Because I've just had a 12-year ordeal with the Vatican, and I'm not going through that again for the sake of religion. He said, I'll tell you a story. I began my priesthood in West Virginia, and it was during the Civil Rights Movement. And I took on the head of the coal companies around civil rights. He said, I'm a fighter. I'm a street fighter. I may not read any of your books, but I'll protect you from the right wing. And I said, we can do business together. And I shook hands. Oh, yeah. When parishioners heard about it at Grace Cathedral, there was objections. And Bishop Swing wrote in the Episcopal newsletter, I remember the title of the article was, Let Them Rave for God's Sake. And he went on and said, people are bitching because the young are being invited into church to rave and pray and new forms of worship. He said, for years, young people have been leaving the church, and I've never gotten a letter objecting. Now that we're doing something for them, the letters are coming in. So let them rave, for God's sake. Which was, what he promised me he'd do. He stood up to the murmurantes, those who murmur. Mm-hmm. And that's just one example. Well, I never took it personally. I always knew it was political because they silenced 3 Catholic theologians the same year. Myself, in North America, Leonardo Buff in South America, and Eugene Druermann in Germany. Now, what did we have in common? Each of us was the most read Catholic theologian in our country or our continent. And so that's a political move. They were going to shoot down these 3 people, public people, theologians, to send a message to all other theologians to get in line, that they're serious about controlling things.
And they were reacting mainly to what, the cosmic Christ idea?
And so my response was, first of all, they really feel threatened by this. This is really an issue for them. And then I realized how invested patriarchy is in original sin. It's just a great way to keep people under the thumb. But as I learned from Jewish students of mine way back at Barra College, Jesus never heard of original sin because no Jews ever heard of original sin. It was Augustine, 4th century. See, I didn't know this. And of course, I started to research it. Augustine, 4th century, first person to use the term. And here the Catholic Church has invested so heavily in it for 16th century sins. What's this about? It's about running an empire. You're going to run an empire, original sin is a great idea. Get them to line up and go kill in the name of Jesus. Boy, you got them covered. So that's what I learned, is how they overreacted. Because also I was careful in my book. I did not deny original sin entirely. I just said the Bible is about original blessing, first of all. Check Genesis 1. And if you begin to sin, you're beginning with the human. And there's a lot of creation before the human came along. It had nothing to do with sin. And furthermore, it's not in there because Jews wrote the book and they don't believe it. They don't have it in there. This was made up in the century, the 4th century, when the church inherited the empire. And Augustine created an imperial theology. But they so overreacted because they said, I denied original sin. But I was careful, and I didn't. And my provincial, who was a theologian of sort, he had published some books, one. Anyway, he defended me. He wrote back and he said, he said in Teilhard, blah, blah, blah. He defended me for several years, but then the pressure was so great that he began to wilt under the pressure after 10 years. And all this time, they were trying to shut down my program at Holy Names College, which was very ecumenical. We had Yoruba priests. They didn't know about the Yoruba priestess. We used to teach them they taught African dance. But they knew about Starhawk, who was a Wicca, and a wonderful prophetic Jewish woman who's always stood for the prophetic. But they, and I had Native American, they complained about that. That was part of, there was a list of 7 things, and one of them was I worked too closely with Native Americans. I think what they meant was he put up a sweat lodge on the campus, Catholic campus. I don't think there's anything like that anywhere in the world. And we would have wonderful sweats, the faculty, the staff, students, all together.
So at some point, you said you were silenced, or you were publish, or?
Yeah, I was silenced for a year.
And what does that mean?
No teaching, no lecturing, no preaching, and no publishing.
And did you follow that at the time?
I did. It wasn't an easy decision to make, but my master general, the head guy in Rome, head of the Dominicans, and my provincial said, do it. It'll make it easier for us and all this, and do it. Now, the same year, they silenced Leonardo Buff Franciscan in Brazil, liberation theologian. And they silenced him first, so I kind of observed how he handled it.
And this is Ratzinger under John Paul II.
Exactly, Ratzinger. You know, John Paul II brought the Inquisition back. There's no question about it. And Ratzinger was his hatchet man, and he loved it. So I was silenced for a year, and then they didn't tell me I was unsilenced, and I waited another month, and I waited another month. So really it was 14 months. And finally I went to my provincial and said, what is this? Well, he said, just start talking, you know. But because they had told me that Rome would tell me conducting it, but that was it. So the first public event I gave after my 14 months of silence was a big event in America. It was in Chicago, called The Action, which is progressive Catholic. There were like 2,000 people. It was a conference, but I was one of the main speakers. And so I had, in a dreamed, it told me what to say. My opening line was, as I was saying 14 months ago, when I was so rudely interrupted. Now, I thought I'd get a laugh, but I got 2 laughs. The first phrase was a laugh, and they just roared. It went on. And then I had to repeat the first part to get to the second part when I was so rudely interrupted, and the whole place just erupted. And like the National Catholic Reporter did an article on it. And they spent the whole time in that one thing. They didn't talk about anything else I said in my talk. But it was a special moment. I don't regret it. But I heard later that it really flipped the Vatican off again because, you know, inquisitors don't have real good senses of humor. That's where they're lacking. And so that kept them on my trail. They were not pleased with that. And within 3 years, I was expelled from the order. And after 34 years. And yeah, so
and what was that experience of being expelled like?
But the doorbell rang one day, and there was this pink slip from the Vatican, delivered by, I think it was, it was one of these delivery systems, and you know, saying that I'm out of the order and to never wear the habit again. Well, I'd already given the habit away to a Jewish friend of mine who was an actor, and I'd written a play on Meister Eckhart, and he had worn the habit, and he wanted to keep it, I guess, and I didn't have a use for it. I never wore it those years. So anyway, I remember. But I sat down on my steps with this dismissal missive in my hands, and I said, what's the meaning of this? And then a word came I'd never heard before, saying, you are a post-denominational priest. I said, well, that's interesting. But how did it feel? Well, first thing is, I was surprised and naive. And secondly, I was sorry. I felt sad because I had given 34 years, good years, to this community. So that was a community. And I enjoyed them, and I thought they enjoyed me. I mean, there were times in the past when my provincials would praise me for my work and things like that. But their pitch was, well, I called in a canon lawyer when things were getting really hot, and I gave him the documents from Rome to my provincial, and then from there to me, to study and tell me, you know. And he had worked in Rome, he knew Rome well, and he was working in San Francisco diocese at the time. And he sat me down, and I had a little team with me in my living room, and he said, he said, you are in the sights of Ratzinger. He will not let go. He will do everything he can to destroy you. And this is what he will do. He will eventually give your provincial, or your master general, any provincial, an order that you cannot in conscience obey. Then they will kick you out for disobedience, because we take a vow of obedience, and his hands will look clean. Well, that's exactly what happened, because the order they gave me eventually was to quit my work in Oakland. Well, you see, another thing that happened is the Dutch Dominicans offered me asylum. They said this: you can join our province and still work in California, and then come in the summers to be with us in Europe. And you can work in Europe. Europeans want your work. There's been a lot of translations of your books here. I said, wow, what a marvelous solution. They had everyone in their provincial council sign this letter saying, we accept Matt Fox. But the rules are, the province you're leaving has to approve. Say, okay, take them. But when I said that to my provincial, who was at least 10 years younger than me in the order, he slammed his fist on the table and said, I don't want you in any province in the world. So that was the end of that. But God is not Catholic, nor is God Jewish. And Spirit is not Catholic or Jewish. So, and the Anglicans, the Episcopalians, I'll call them, I'm grateful that they offered me religious asylum. It would have been easier for me to take an asylum from the Dominicans and stayed in the Catholic Church like that. But being outside, I've learned a lot of things about ecumenism. Would I have been exposed to all the things I've been exposed to since? No, I don't think I would have. And I've kind of been forced to live more ecumenism than I would have lived, I think, and see the world from the other side. So a lot of, gifts have come out of it. And so I don't really pass judgment on it so much. The biggest disappointment for me was what I would call lack of courage on the part of the Dominicans, because I see courage as being one of the real tests. Jesus talks about, by their fruits you'll know them. I think the two fruits of spirituality in our time that I know are reliable are joy and courage. And if either is missing, and especially the courage is missing, people aren't living spiritual lives. I don't think your life is deep if you don't have courage. And courage sometimes means standing up to institutions and forces and powers that are acting badly. Now, I see this Pope Francis, who I think has a decent view of the world and all this. He certainly makes mistakes, but he's done some good things. Laudato Si, by the way, Laudato Si probably wouldn't have been written if I had left my school, because it was written by one of my students. 80% of it, it was written by Sean McDonough, who is an Irish priest who was a missionary in the Philippines. And he went through our program, master's program, and then went back and wrote a series of short books on spirituality and ecology, which Pope Francis obviously learned about, and he called him to Rome to write encyclical. So that's something I say. Two popes called my work dangerous and deviant, which they did. And the third one is plagiarizing my work. And it's all over, but I see it's all over. Christ pictures everywhere in Laudato Si. So that's kind of nice. I say I've lived a full circle of a life.
Tell me, what are you most grateful for?
Most grateful for, so much. I'm most grateful for life, for my health, for my family and the values I was taught, basically, for education, for my education, which is unique, really, that I got to go to Paris and study with Shnu, the last class he ever taught, and other wonderful teachers there. And the wonderful teachers I've had since, especially the scientists I've worked with, Baron Swim, Thomas Berry, Rupert Sheldrake, and so many others. I'm grateful to be living at this unique time, which really is a time of passage. And that I had the many opportunities and the good health, because that's part of being silenced and expelled and all that too, is, there have been many priests of my generation who died of heart attacks because they were silenced, or lost their living because they were silenced. And because, it's a big scarlet X on your forehead, within the Catholic Church. So the point is that like there was a fine French theologian who was silenced in all this, and he was last seen driving a taxi in Paris, So I mean, when you work, your lifetime to study and be, adept at your work, such as a theologian, and have that ripped away from you. And of course, you can't get jobs in Catholic school and stuff. One pays a real price. And but I've been blessed that I've been able to find work beyond any particular denomination. And of course, I started my own university when they kicked me out of Holy Names, and 95% of my faculty came with me. And so we had a beautiful 9 years, a strong 9 years, and we started a doctoral program, and really reinvented what theological education can be, because we had a doctoral ministry in work. And my whole thesis was that Luther talked about the priesthood of all believers. I talk about the priesthood of all workers. There are people doing good work in the world, they're priests, because archetypally a priest I define as a midwife of grace. So this book of yours and what you're doing, you're a midwife of grace. Mm-hmm. And our good work and whatever it is, you could be a therapist, you could be a carpenter, you could be a mechanic, repairing people's car engines, you can be a cook. Everything has a spiritual sacred dimension if it's good work. If you're just in there to make money like Rupert Murdoch is, that's something else. But so the dignity of work, is where most people, so that's in my book, work, most people leave their footprint and their gift to the world through their work. And that's a beautiful thing. It should be honored. And it is in the most raw sense of the archetype of the priesthood. That's where midwifing is going on. And so even that is part of the gift that I've been given, the blessings that I've had, that I can write about these things and talk about them and meet with all kinds of workers and work with all kinds of workers, and try to articulate just a little of the wisdom that they've extended to me.
What's your greatest wish?
My greatest wish, that human beings would wake up, would grow up, would, first of all, be grateful for existence, for these 13.8 billion years that have brought us here, so that we would give thanks, blessing, return blessing for blessing, and that we would reinvent education, politics, economics, religion, media, the art, and everything else to carry on this amazing species that we are, and get it tuned to the earth and her needs. And that means all the creatures on the earth, and tuned to our real needs, which are inner needs. Thomas Merton has this amazing passage where, he was alive when we were aiming for the moon, but he died before he got there. But he was the only one I know that was a naysayer. And he was a naysayer because he has this wonderful passage. I could get it for you. It's in my book on Merton. Or I can just paraphrase it. But he said, what good is it? So what good is it if humans can fly? Even ants fly. They're flying ants, he said. And sailing to the moon, what good is it going to do? And we're just going to take our troubles to Venus and to Mars, he said. The most important discovery is the inner discovery, and it's much harder than getting to the moon and back. And this is what we have to do first. We have to find out who we are, because otherwise we'll take our violence and our projections and all the rest to colonize some other planet. So, I mean, and that he resisted the entire ethos of the 60s, late 60s, where everyone was all charged up to get to the moon, to say these things. I think it's really powerful and really important. That's what I want. I want humanity to deal with humanity. And, you know, I want to believe there are other planets that have intelligent life on it, but I'm not naive about that. When I read about what had to happen on Earth for life to happen, and then for intelligent life to happen, and there's so many needles that were threaded. I'm not convinced. I want there to be other planets where there's this intelligent life, but I'm not convinced we're going to find them. I mean, and if we don't, that's just really interesting. But even if we don't, we know they're awfully far away. And why don't we just do this one smart thing and take care of our own planet and our own species? And that has to include inner work. And that's where the mystical traditions and psychology and those who deal with shadow, which is psychology, you know, with our obvious.
Well, I want to thank you so much. I don't know how I ended up a Jew, all of whose heroes are Catholic monks or previous Catholic priests.
Right.
Merton, Anthony DeMello, Henry Nouwen, Thomas Keating, you. I've gained such inspiration and meaning. It's so interesting to me as a Jew, who first of all was taught to fear Christianity, although we had
pretty good reasons. I mean,
although we had some very positive experiences with nuns and priests when I was a kid, more in terms of the civil rights movement. But it's amazing to me how much meaning has come from Merton, DeMello, Nouwen, and now you, from the, or at least with roots in the Catholic Church, which in some ways seems completely at odds with what the Catholic Church is today. As you said, this intellectual, mystical pursuit.
I'll tell you one compliment I got that I'll never forget. Years ago, the black pastor of the biggest black church in Oakland, and the most doing the best work, just in all kinds of areas. He said the BBC came to interview me or something during the sciencing stuff and all that, but before couldn't be during. But anyway, I said, well, you can go talk to him, because I invited him to come and lecture at my program. And he brought my original blessing book, and I'll never forget his opening line. He held it up and said, see this book? He said, my people need this more than they need jobs. I almost fell out of my chair. He said, because what slavery ultimately did to us was to take our dignity away. And original blessing, brings it back. So BBC went to interview them, and they talked about me. And he said to BBC, he said, Matt Fox is so ahead of the church that the church confuses him with the enemy. That's one of the funniest things I've ever heard. But it comes back. For one guy, this guy was a fighter. I mean, he was a black pastor who had to hold so much together and did it, over decades. He was the greatest black pastor in Oakland, in a black, was essentially a black city. But he said that so far the church confused him with the enemy. I just thought, well, that names it. It names it with humor and accuracy. I mean, at least I want to believe that that's where my troubles come from. That I'm the enemy, but I'm a made-up enemy.
Well, I can tell you, I'm one of, as one person, I'm just grateful that you, as I said at the beginning, brought clarity to ideas that give me hope and meaning and direction for what it means to be in mystery and in faith at this time of civilization. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you for doing what you're doing. This is wonderful, wonderful work. I think it's more important than you even know. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, thank you.